Today's penultimate episode of Socially Democratic for 2024 is now available on Patreon. Join our Socially Democratic community for free or for as little as $2.50 a month, and you can help support the show. And when you sign up as a campaign organizer, you get access to our premium episodes and a free ticket to a live show. Plus, you get Haters Hate and the Rest Vote Labor merch. Today's episode is also brought to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specializes in community organizing. We only work with people who want to make the world a better place, and we develop community engagement strategies to win campaigns, both big and small, and we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Marshall Gantz framework of leadership, organising and action. And if you want to create action in your world, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. And they've been fighting for workers' rights in this great country of ours for more than 100 years, and they've helped more than 500,000 people get the compensation they deserve. So if you've been injured at work or on the road, you may have a claim through your superannuation. So for expert and empathetic legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left and organising podcast that drops every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And abroad, we are definitely going. This is our international politics year in review episode with Katie Parsons. So we are going to be covering all of the elections that happened in the year 2024. Quite an epic episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the show once you've finished listening. And to follow Socially Democratic on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Tuesday morning, to check that, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And as you'll know from the show notes, it's December. We're doing all of our end of year reviews. This is one I particularly like. It's our international politics year in review. And joining us for today's episode is someone who you are familiar with because we hung out with each other for 4 weeks in a row during the US presidential election campaign coverage. Didn't end the way we wanted it to, but still enjoyed their company. And they were good enough to come back and join us for our international review. She's actually quite an expert in this area as well. So she's the Senior VP for 270 Strategies, which is a Democratic consultancy. She's based in Chicago, the home of my sister-in-law. Hello, Jana. Her name is Katie Parsons. Katie, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Hi, thanks. Good to see you.
Hopefully we've recovered from the US election and we're now mentally ready to talk about the world.
Yeah, to the degree that there is a recovery from that. Yeah. You know, I'm good at putting things in boxes and putting them to the side.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I find that I actually have tapped into my Irish Catholic repression and I am not reading as much of the New York Times or the Washington Post or any kind of US politics. I'm jumping in and out, grabbing the odd article, reading about that. But broadly speaking, I am really not engaging right now. And I only realized that the other day and I thought, oh, Stephen, you're still not over this. You need a little bit more time.
But how convenient. I mean, that's really nice for you.
Yeah, I know.
You don't have to follow this, you know?
Yes, that's a very good point. That is a very good point. My football team in Scotland is Celtic, and they were shit in the 1990s. And so there was a distance that we had between Melbourne and Glasgow that I didn't have to completely deal with the brutality of how bad we were, as my cousins would constantly remind me. And you're right, the distance between Australia and the US is a large Pacific Ocean that I can check out. I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't have reminded you, Katie, of your existence in the United States. My apologies.
Oh, it's just part of daily life.
It is. We dust ourselves off and pick ourselves up and go again. Okay. So we've got a lot to get through. Not easy to cover the world in 90 minutes or in an hour. But obviously, particularly this year, right? This has been a big year. 2024 was the year of elections all around the world. 70 countries had a national election. And obviously the big ones, the UK went to the polls. We had the European parliamentary elections. Big democracies, India had an election. Obviously the United States in November. One of the things that I've thought about every time, particularly, Western centric media markets will, when the UK, Australia, maybe some of the Western European countries, the United States, go to the polls, and if the right wins, they tend to link it. Oh, this is a rejection of centre left politics, and it's all happening around the world. And as if all of those voters all know, as if all those voters are going to the polls and going, well, France voted for the centre right, the other week, so I think I might too. I just don't think they are. I personally don't think they are connected. Obviously, there are trends that are happening, but I still think voters vote on local issues, not on what's happening globally. Because when we win, no one's running around going, the centre left, they've unlocked, the key to success. It's not like as if we all meet in some kind of secret location known as the Meadows every year, all the leaders of centre-left political campaigns, and devise new ways to win election campaigns. You and I know that because you and I first met in Brussels many, many years ago, and that meeting wasn't like that. And we still struggle to try and work out ways to win. But there are obviously links and there are trends, and I'm just interested to get it. Just before we dive into some of these countries, what are some of the broader trends that you did see across the year with all of these various elections being held?
Yeah. No, I appreciate that because I do think it's always, there's a danger of smoothing results and trying to, read sort of global lessons and things where, actually the circumstances are quite different in different places. There's always, some local corruption scandal. In fact, there have been lots of those that drive results. And so as much as it is true that the vast majority of incumbents either lost or at least lost share of vote in the elections this year, it is obviously more complicated than that. When I've been looking for patterns that go a little bit beyond that, I think one thing that we're seeing pretty consistently is that populists are winning. So in the couple of places where you see more left-leaning governments winning, and particularly when they've been incumbents, they have been the more populist candidate or, among a series of populist candidates. It's different in the UK. So again, there are always outliers. But I think that has been a consistent trend. One of the other just kind of like questions I've been asking myself or trying to understand better, corruption has played a big role in the narrative in a lot of these different elections. And in some cases, we'll talk about this more, like in South Africa and South Korea and Japan too, there have been very specific, corruption scandals with particular elected officials or their wives sometimes. And that has driven some protest vote. But I think more broadly, even looking at some of the narrative in the US, for example, and kind of everywhere, there's populists have been trying to point out the other side, their opponents, as those who are corrupt. And there's always been this kind of confusion, I think, amongst at least the political class to say, wait a second, they're the ones who are corrupt. Crony capitalists are the ones who are handing out jobs and money to their family members, if you look at Trump. But there's sort of this more like broad generalization that the left is somehow only in it for themselves or for the institutions that is kind of cast as corruption. And I think the populist leaders have been much more effective at playing that role as like, well, I'm an asshole, but I'm your asshole. It's sort of, maybe there's some corruption, maybe I'm passing those jobs and deals around, but at the same time, they're portraying it as helping the common man in a way that I think we haven't been on the left quite as effective at messaging. So that like the more complicated understandings of corruption, I think, are something interesting to look at into the next year and how we talk about that. Those are really the kind of big picture trends I've tried to identify.
The other one, which, I mean, it was you that actually raised it on the final episode of our US election coverage podcast with Ross Morales Riquetto, is that you were the one who said, up until that point anyway, no incumbent government seeking re-election had been re-elected. I didn't even know that. I was shocked. And as soon as you said that, I just felt like that this was this massive mountain for anyone trying to climb. But the other thing that needs to be touched on, obviously, is that normally incumbency has always been a positive for a government, particularly a first-term government, right? You'd like to think that, particularly in liberal democracies, you get elected, the voters give you a chance, you do a good job, the voters reward you then with normally a landslide, or certainly there's always that core group of voters out there that just go with the winning team. They're not the ones that jump first. They're not the ones that will give a new team an election a go, unless the incumbent is so bad. But they're the ones who, when I think about it in an Australian context, it's the eastern suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide and places like that, right? But if they see a government do a good job for 4 years, they go, right, okay, yep, I'll go with them. And then that's when you see, congressional seats be swept to the good guys. That's not happening at the moment. And a lot of it is, to do with economics, and this sort of post-COVID kind of, inflation and global inflation and cost of living pressures and all that kind of stuff. I just want to get your thoughts on how much of an undercurrent is that, and how did we know about that? Like, did these political parties around the world know that and realize that these were significant headwinds?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the couple of places where incumbents held on or even made gains, Mexico, Ireland, these are the places that actually had, real positive economic headwinds. And more importantly, the narrative was that the economy was positive in both of these places. And I'm sure that there are a couple of other places that fall into the same category. But your question of like, do people know that like there's a global trend and use that in their campaign planning? I think like yes and no. You may be aware of it because you're reading whatever, the Atlantic or the Economist or something, and those guys are talking about it. But I think you still, especially if you work on campaigns, always believe that you have some agency and some ability to control the narrative and the outcome. And so and that's true. Like you have to act as if it is possible to overcome those barriers, even if ultimately it's not, right? Because you can only do the best with the situation that you have. So, I think Democrats have known, if we're going to talk about the US, like have known that the economy was going to be an issue, since 2020, frankly. And like we knew in 2022, heading into the midterms, that the economy was a dangerous subject for us because we were still coming out of COVID, the impacts of COVID. We were really at peak inflation in 2022, more so than now, certainly. And so heading into the congressional midterms, we were really nervous that we would lose a lot of seats. It was a big surprise, actually, that didn't happen. And we held on and, in fact, gained seats because, we also had the abortion issue become something that really overtook the narrative. But I don't think it was a surprise that it was the economy, but whoever is in power at a time when the government or when the economy is not doing well, whether it, there's a direct link between their leadership and those economic difficulties or not, it's hard for them to tell a story that like, hey, it's not my fault, but you're in power. So whose fault are voters supposed to think it is?
It's the other thing that makes me think about it as well is that the economic conditions have changed so much since COVID. Pre-COVID, cash was cheap. And so traditional social democratic or Labor or centre-left governments or parties, I think the effective ones were the ones that were reasonably big spending, but spending on infrastructure and particularly targeted infrastructure into communities that needed things built to make their lives easier. Schools, hospitals, public transport, bridges, roads, airports, whatever it may be. certainly, I mean, that's been the recipe, I think, for success here in my own country
Yeah.
at a state level. I don't think, and it's not just. There's two parts to that story, though, isn't it? It's not just doing it, but it's also then communicating to the voters that you are doing it and you're responsible for it. So therefore, they reward you at the polls. And maybe the IRA, and by that I don't mean a provisional paramilitary group in Ireland, but I mean the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States was a great piece of public legislation, public policy, sorry.
Yeah.
But it was wrapped up in a way that no one even freaking knew about it. So therefore, there wasn't how much reward was being borne at a local level. But I'm going somewhere with this because I want to talk about Britain. Keir Starmer and Labor obviously were elected this year after ending a decade of Tory rule in the United Kingdom. And I think they're grappling with the fact that they've got an economy, this post-COVID economy, where they don't actually have a lot of cash. There are serious structural problems with the British economy, particularly post-Brexit and then post-COVID. They had a double whammy. They left the European Union and then they got COVID. They spent all their money. They've got no more money left. Their revenue base is low. And so if you want to fix the problems that are going on in Britain, it's going to cost you, but they don't have any cash to do it. And they're trying to do things that aren't inflationary. And so they're in a bit of a pickle right now. And I just think it must be challenging for social democratic incumbents right now to work out how do we spend our way out of the problems that we're facing in our communities. And that must be, I don't know the answer. I'm not an economist, so I don't know the answer to that on my campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and you're seeing the impacts of that in France, in Germany, and at least in the UK. They're no longer being members of the EU, or they're not subject to the same, ECB caps on what your deficit can be and things like that. But they're still feeling that pressure. And I think, to Labour's credit, they're trying to be responsible. And Keir Starmer, from the moment he took over as leader of the party from Corbyn, his brand has always been pretty milquetoast, right? Like a really boring guy, but a steady pair of hands and somebody who's trusted. It's almost more, as we look at all these elections, everybody's moving away from the policy guy, from the calm and reassuring expert. This is one of those few cases where we went back towards someone who fits more of that profile. And I think that's probably, like you said, that you've had 10 years of Tories. I think it was Starmer's the sixth prime minister in just the last couple of years. Yeah. Oh, well, okay. Since 2016, he's the fifth prime minister. People are tired of the Tories. They've had those cycles of change that everybody else is looking for by kicking out their incumbents in other places.
And talking about these trends and bucking these trends, and the reason, one of the reasons why in the UK we saw this trend buck was simply because how bad the Tory party and the government had been. It was a joke. You couldn't write a script worse than this one in the way that they cycled through so many prime ministers. And the Liz Truss one they bottomed out. They absolutely bottomed out in that moment. That if Labor didn't win that election, you'd be looking at yourself going what, you don't need to do anything. And they basically didn't do anything. They just offered a very, as you said, milquetoast offering to the electorate, saying we're just not that. And they were successful in getting elected. And it was weird because I guess when we win elections, we like the Tony Blair 97 type elections where, Labor or the good guys are swept to power in this momentum of positivity and fresh outlook and new start, new Labor, and that didn't happen in this one. It wasn't as if we were going to get elected in the middle of the night, but it kind of was very much, it was just safe as houses kind of, do you know what I mean? It was just kind of everyone was like, Keir got elected. Well, he should have anyway. And that was it.
Yeah. I mean, I think just incidentally, I was in London on July 4th when the election happened, watching the results with some friends. And I would say there was a lot of excitement for like 4 days, right? And people were excited. There was a change. It felt like, a reminder that people have the power to make change in their government. And then I think more of the like global zeitgeist and the economic conditions that the UK is facing settle back in and like, oh, right. we're all kind of in rough shape. Labor doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver, but at least we have a new set of people to try their best, try their hand at making something of this. We've already been through all of the leaders and the Tories, we've been through their whole bench. So it's, Labor has a tough run. I want to give them a little bit of credit to I know we all care a lot about field and organizing, and they did a great job of, as they always do, really, of hitting doors and trying to make connections with people at the local level. I know there have been quite a few candidates this go around who'd been out on the doorstep for 2 years. They'd really been planning and building towards this, even if the conditions, the political conditions, hadn't been so perfect for them. I think they did a lot of the right things from an infrastructure standpoint to set themselves up for a powerful election. But you also had, previous Prime Minister Rishi Sunak like choose the absolute worst moment he could have for the Tories to call another election. So they've kind of had both things going in their favor, at least from an election standpoint. Governing is different.
Yeah. Can we let's head across the channel to Europe. June this year they had their European parliamentary elections, and the big winners out of it were the centre right and the hard right. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember who I had on the show to talk about that at the time. I feel like it might have been John McTiernan. I can't remember, but his view was that you can't read too much into the European parliamentary elections as a broad thing. And I guess this is probably the thesis of our show that talked about the top anyway. He said you really need to narrow down and, it's almost country by country, race by race to get a sense of what actually is the undercurrents of why people are voting. Because I don't think people look at Brussels and go, you're to blame. Europeans globally don't look at Brussels and go, right, you're to blame, and so I'm voting with my feet on this one. It's more like, I'm shitty with this particular person in my own country. I will use these European elections to send a message. What was your take on the European elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a good reminder. And right, like you said, we're going to keep saying that again, as much as for the sake of a podcast and as being like foreign policy and foreign election nerds, you want to kind of have a theory of the case and find your trends. You always have to go back to the local specifics. And that's true with the EU elections too. The other couple of general things though, to find some trends, the EU elections are boring, right? There's always relatively low turnout. People in Europe have a very, kind of opaque sense of what it is that their MEPs, their members of the European Parliament, actually do. And so to that sense, are they actually voting for these parties for what they're going to do in the European Parliament? No, not exactly. It's certainly always a referendum on whatever's going on nationally. But the other thing that's true is that the places where the EU does act in big ways and in ways that people really understand and perceive at the national level are immigration, energy, foreign policy, right? Foreign security policy, particularly Ukraine. And then when you go back to the budgets, again, people understand, even if they don't know exactly how the ECB works or how, Europe actually controls their monetary policy, they do know that there are caps on their national budgets and that their national governments are hamstrung by trying to meet the goals or targets that are set at a European level. So when you look at these places that are really struggling to pull together a budget, They may not know exactly why, but they know that Europe is part of the challenge. And obviously, I hope it goes without saying that I'm very pro EU, but kind of all of the things that have been headwinds for the left in general at a national level, at least in the West, are very much dealt with at the EU level. And so I think some of the movement towards the right, the hard right, is a reflection of that. The same kind of, the same votes at the national level are happening at the European level. Important to note that centrists are still in charge in the EU. So between the European Parliamentary Party and then what's the one for the Social Democrats? PES, right?
Yep, PES, yep.
Yeah, PES, thank you. They're basically controlling the story at this point. It's not like the far right actually is controlling what's happening. They've just taken a bigger share. Still not great, but you don't want to read too much into it.
It's also weird that you'd get swings to the far right who historically have been anti-European or certainly Eurosceptic, yet folks are voting for them and then send them to Brussels to then sit in a chamber that they don't agree should exist in the first place. I've always found that fascinating.
Right. I mean, Nigel Farage, right, the architect of the exit of Brexit, really, was a member of European Parliament for a long time. So, yeah, that's been a funny trend for a long time.
Now, when those European elections happened, who knew that out of that we would have snap elections in France afterwards? I was in Europe at the time of them when Macron called their snap elections for the generalists, for the effectively the Legislative Assembly, the lower house, the lower chamber of their parliament. But off the back of Marine Le Pen and the far right party in France doing reasonably well at the European elections, he's decided to move. Why? I mean, I'm fascinated to get your take on this because I've read two different kind of theories. One was, isn't Macron a genius? And the other one was, Macron, what are you thinking? You absolute idiot. Why did you do this? And I just want to get your take. First of all, give the viewers a bit of a background about why he moved, and then let's sort of analyze whether this was the right thing to do or not.
Yeah. So the far right did extremely well in France in the European elections. And it at least has been suggested that Macron thought, okay, they're caught up with this victory. They're going to be off kilter. They're also kind of fighting amongst themselves. There were a couple of far right parties, actually. So, and as a centrist, there's going to be a big backlash within France against this victory of the far right. So let's have an election now to capitalize on that. And he did that, and there was a swing against the far right, but it went to the far left. So you actually have, the results of the election when all is said and done. The two biggest blocks are the far right and the far left, and then the center is squeezed in the middle. Very much not what he was hoping for. I think the other maybe more niche theory is he was coming up against a budget deadline. He knew it was going to be impossible to pass a budget with the coalition that he had. Maybe there's the honorable thing to do is to put it to the people and have them sort of declare their preferences by going to an election. But ultimately, he made his hand even weaker. And you've really seen the results of this in the last couple of weeks as the Prime Minister Barnier was ousted on a no confidence vote because he couldn't get a budget passed. And you've already got a new prime minister. Lots of suggestions that Macron should step down. But his election is not until 2027. And he's come out saying he's not going to do that. And I would be astonished if he were to step down just based on how he's always operated. So, perhaps somebody could have said before the elections, this is a stroke of genius, but I don't think anybody could say it now.
No, I mean, not at all. Like, if we can look at it from the left's perspective, one of the things that Macron thought he was doing was to your point, yes, catching the internal divisions of the far right off guard, off kilter, post the European Euro parliamentary elections. But also he thought he was going to catch the left off guard as well, because there is lots of divisions between the socialists, which, is the party of Mitterrand, and, once was. It's really, really sad actually to see how the Socialist Party has gone from being one of the most important parts of the Fifth Republic to being a minor party now. We could do a whole podcast on just that alone. Plus the Greens, plus the Communists, plus a couple of other groupings. And so they could never get their shit together. And in fact, they tried to earlier in the year, and it fell apart. And so when Macron's called the election, it's forced them all back into a room again, literally back into a room again. And they've had a meeting, and they've finally actually come to an agreement on 3 key policy issues. And then they've walked out of it and said, okay, we're gonna run a unified ticket, and it's going to be called the New Popular Front. And Macron was like, what? That's not supposed to happen. You're supposed to be classic sort of lefty, division as death kind of operators, but they didn't. And they got their shit together. And they managed to actually just run candidates in all of the constituencies and didn't cut each other's lunch. Yeah. But in the end, they kind of did a deal with Macron's party as well, where they didn't, if they couldn't field a candidate where Macron had a candidate, also they would run dead, and vice versa, which I guess that's the unwritten story as well. There was a bit of an arrangement, really wasn't there, between Macron's centrist party and the left against the far right and the fascists. It was this kind of, it's certainly written in the French papers as mobilization against, the rise of the Vichy French again, which I thought was quite interesting. But obviously I think Macron came out of this looking weaker.
Absolutely. And you saw with the collapse of the government just a couple of weeks ago, the far left, that New Popular Front, and the far right banding together to oust the government too. So I think the real lesson here, certainly in France and perhaps in other places too, is people are learning to be a lot more strategic and to make deals to get into power in a way that, even a couple of years ago, you could always laugh and point at the various small parties for really sticking very rigidly to whatever their one, kind of policy platform is, and knowing that would be their constituency. But now people are really learning to use their power in interesting ways.
Yeah. Can we move to Eastern Europe? And this is an area where I really am out of my depth, but I'm going to lean heavily on your expertise here, Katie. There's a number of elections in sort of in the sort of the Warsaw Pact kind of part of the continent: Romania, Moldova, Georgia. What's going on over there?
So much drama, and you're right. Like these are less covered in the news, but there's actually a lot happening. So you had Moldova, Romania, and Georgia had elections the last couple of months. Moldova is right next to Romania and also Ukraine. Always has been a battle between pro-EU and pro-Russia. And they reelected their pro-European president, which was, first of all, an incumbent one, and also was really celebrated in Europe because there were lots of fears about Russian interference in elections in general. We've heard about that in the U.S., but it's happening even more in Eastern Europe, where it's just harder to keep security. So it was a big positive sign that the pro-European candidate was able to stay in power there. It's a small country, but meaningful as a signal. Then we had the election in Georgia, where there had been already a lot of same battle. Is it pro-EU versus pro-Russia? And the Georgian Dream, which is kind of the pro-Russia party that has been in power since 2012, basically ran away with it. But the suggestion is that they really stuffed the ballot boxes, that these are not the actual results of the election. So not just that, we're surprised at the results and people, were leaning towards the populists more than we expected. what we're talking about the results being in the US. It was more that actually they just cheated. So Europeans have come out and suggested that that's the case, that these are not legitimate results. And in retaliation for that, the parliament under Georgian Dream has canceled European accession talks. So, they just have like these regular meetings that are more like stepping stones to how's your administration doing? Do you have, the rule of law, things going well? They canceled the meeting because they were like, well, you didn't, you're saying we cheated in the election. Why would we meet with you? And this has kicked off weeks of protests in the street because people are just really pissed off that probably they did steal the election and that they've made such a drastic move to pull out of these EU talks. Then in just the last couple of days, so the president was up for the presidential election was up anyway, and that person is appointed by the parliament, but they have booted out the only remaining pro-EU government official, essentially, and put in former Man City football player is their new president. And the former president has been saying essentially that she won't step down. And just like hot tip, she is a badass bitch. She was my one of my professors in grad school and like one of the most amazing people. Absolutely terrifying. I loved her. So I wouldn't expect her to go quietly. But so that, that's kind of the opposite end of what happened in Moldova. You had the pro-Russians winning and a real sense that Russia's interference was able to help them to help them come out on top. So we thought that those were the two extremes. And then Romania had an election. And just like most of the other European countries where you've got lots of different parties, there are kind of three main parties in Romania. And there was a far-right party that was doing well. There were lots of concerns that, because they go to a runoff, there were lots of concerns that somebody at the head of the far-right party would come out and make it to the runoff. And so was it going to be the far-right versus the center or the far-right versus the left? And then lots of other fringe random candidates. And the far-right guy didn't come ahead. It was somebody like even further right of him, somebody nobody'd really heard of. Nobody was even talking about this guy, Georgescu, because it was such a, lightweight from a campaign perspective. He came out on top. He was the number one vote earner. And then the Liberals, so the center party person was the other one who would have made it to the runoffs. And since the election, there's been all this coming out about TikTok and Russian aligned TikTok, bots and TikTok farm kind of situation running campaign ads for this guy, Georgescu. So the Constitutional Court has thrown out the results and they're just going to rerun the election sometime next year. I mean, this is, it's fun because of the drama, but I think really worth like pausing and on the fact that they actually threw out the results. Like if you think about as much angst as the calls of Russian interference caused in the U.S. and but we still accepted the results, right? Actually just completely cancel the results of an election really undermines people's faith in democracy. And so I think it was a pretty bold move to do that. And I think a lot of folks are rightly questioning whether actually was that the best move, or would it have been better to just go ahead and go to the second round where probably the centrists would have won.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall or thereabouts. And so that probably feels like a long, long time ago, but in the grand scheme of things, 30 years to be a fledgling democracy after you've stepped out of, the shadows of totalitarian Soviet era communism for these countries and trying to embrace liberal democratic values and norms must be a challenge. Because I just, you just constantly read about this in all of those former Soviet state style nations, them dealing with this sort of stuff. There was a guy from Albania who was involved in the centre-right party that I knew through my organising work, and he's centre-right, so you'd think, him and our politics don't align. But he was sort of telling me about what the experience is for him in his own party, but also in Albania, the centre-left are notionally in power there. And he said they are so corrupt. They're just basically the communists repainted as, now Democrats. And he said they're not. They're no different. It's the sons and daughters of the Soviet era leaders that are now running Albania, and they're up to their necks in corruption. And he goes, and I'm on the centre-right, and my party is like, well, the only way we can compete is to be corrupt as well. And he said, I'm just trying to fight back against that within my own party, let alone taking on, the left. And I kind of felt it was like a come to Jesus moment for me, going, this isn't even like a center left, center right kind of traditional, fight. This is pro-democracy versus anti-democracy kind of stuff going on in Eastern Europe. Is that a fair take?
Yeah. I mean, I would narrow it a little bit from just Eastern Europe, because I think like Poland and the Czech Republic would bristle at that. But yeah, I think corruption is rife in lots of these places, and more than that, even the parties often tend to still be formed around some central figure rather than ideologically driven. There are ideologically driven parties. I'm just thinking of like Romania in particular, because my mind is there. Like there is some ideology there, but it doesn't feel at all parallel to the party breakdowns that we are more familiar with.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Should we move out of Europe? Sure. I want to go to... Actually, I want to just very quickly do South Africa. Or parts of Africa that had elections, and obviously South Africa. The one I was interested in there was South Africa, because obviously the ANC have been in power since the shackles of apartheid came crumbling down a long, long time ago. And I've often thought to myself, it's not great for democracy to have the same, as much as, you want to see. I mean, I know that years ago the ANC were within what I'd call the global progress fraternity, but they're not now. They're now seen as more of a hard left political party, but they've been in power, and this is the first time they've had to form a coalition. So in some ways, I think it's a good thing, right, that voters are starting to look elsewhere in South Africa for alternate leadership and alternate ideas. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, what's your take on what happened in South Africa?
No, I agree with that. I think that other political parties in South Africa have been making gains for some time, but have never been able to break through that history, that the ANC has as being the liberators of Black and colored people, which means something very specific in South Africa, right? But basically mixed race folks, and includes a lot of South Indians. The ANC was really seen as the liberator, the Freedom Party, not just seen as, they were. And so people continued to reward them for much longer than they were effective as a government. And more importantly, whenever you have a government that manages to stay in power kind of infinitely, there's going to be corruption. And so that's exactly what happened with the ANC this time. They are still in power, actually. I mean, this is another one of those cases where they lost vote share. They had to form a coalition government for the first time, but they are still leading government. So it's not exactly a fully humbling moment for them, but they formed government with their largest competitor, the DA, the Democratic Alliance, and then a couple of other parties, basically to keep the furthest left out. But it was about corruption. There were specific cases that had come up in the last couple of years, both with the current and previous ANC presidents, and people were frustrated with that enough to, not give them complete control of government without checks.
And Ghana, tell me what happened in Ghana.
Yeah, so Ghana I know personally less well, but it just happened. It's that was on December 8th, I think,
that's fresh.
President. Yeah, it just happened. But it's worth noting because it's yet another country where an incumbent lost power. But the NPP had been in power for 8 years. They basically just swapped power with the other party who they've been trading with essentially every 8 years for the last since I think for the last little while. So I wouldn't say in any way that that's a hugely troubling result, but it is seen as a referendum on the governing party because of the same economic issues, high inflation that incumbents are dealing with everywhere.
I want to go to Asia now, but I'm actually going to, for the first time in their history, I'm going to lump Mexico into Asia. Only because we're talking about big democracies, right?
Yeah.
Mexico, India, and Indonesia all went to the polls this year with interesting results. And on the surface, like a lot of people, particularly Mexico, they elected a woman president. So a lot of people rejoice. This is a great thing. But not necessarily. And I just want to get your take on starting with Mexico, and then we can maybe move to the other two countries as well.
Yeah. So, it's always a great thing when women become the president for the first time. It's not such an surprising result because both of the main parties who were putting up candidates had women, which again is wonderful in and of itself and is actually in some ways a win for quota laws that had been instituted in Mexico, I think 20 years ago. So this is kind of, after you've had 20 years of requiring parties to put up a certain number of women for election, you start to see women come into the top roles. But Claudia Sheinbaum won, and she is really the heir apparent to AMLO, who'd been the president before that. And Mexico, really interestingly, does not allow for a reelection. You have 1 5-year term, and that's it. It's a really interesting way to set up your government. But to the degree that you could say an incumbent won, that's essentially what happened. People resoundingly gave another term to AMLO's party. And it's a really populist government, as we're seeing in, around the world. The AMLO is really known for cash redistribution towards the poorest people, and that kind of social spending is unsurprisingly pretty popular. It's going to be really interesting to see how she does with Trump as president, just north of the border, because there's such serious demands to deal with immigration that, comes through Mexico to the United States. And then also when Trump talks about instituting tariffs, Mexico and Canada are two of the places where he's threatened those first. 25% tariff on all goods from both of those countries, sort of as to say, if you don't stop the flow of people across the border, that's what we're going to do. So she's definitely got a tough situation to the north. Another issue that Mexico deals with is pretty severe cartel crime. And for a long time, the government took a very heavy-handed, strong arm policing response to that. And the previous president and Sheinbaum have said, we're more focused on the causes of this crime rather than heavy policing, but that hasn't really shown to work. So there are a lot of concerns about security.
I wouldn't even begin to know where to start in dealing with such a systemic problem like the cartels in Mexico. We had the leading Change Network, Marshall Gantz's community organising sort of global group, ran a series of sessions on political organising this year to coincide with the fact that there were so many elections. One of the sessions we had someone who ran as a candidate in the Mexican elections at a local government level, and he was just talking about how he used public narrative and sort of various elements of the Gantz framework in his campaign. But one of the things he was talking about was how, like, I think one of his friends was murdered during the election campaign, and he then was assigned security. Like heavy armed police, and all the candidates in that particular constituency were all assigned security for the duration of that campaign. Just take a moment and reflect on that and put yourself in your own, running in, the Wrigley Field area of Chicago, or, the parts of Melbourne that I live in, and you're going to a rally, or you're going to a street stall, and you've got two guys with AK-47s or M16s, with you. That's unthinkable, and that's the life of the democracy in some parts of Mexico, anyway.
Right, and it's not just a lone gunman, right? It's like a whole institution.
It's intimidation.
Yeah, organized crime, essentially, trying to influence the outcome. Yeah,
crazy. What about India and Indonesia? What's been your take from those results? India is such a massive democracy. It's such a huge country that sometimes it can, that it's like trying to say, it's like examining Europe and saying it's one homogenous group when it really isn't. I mean, India is so diverse.
Right. And really, I was thinking about Mexico, India, and Indonesia more like, I think it's more interesting to just lump them together and think about the commonalities. I'm sure you could do a whole show on each of them separately, but they're all massive democracies, some of the largest populations in the world, with currently populist governments who have been really effective at spending money to build roads, redistribute cash from the top to the bottom. All three of them certainly have their issues with corruption, but this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where there's a general sense that people have, that I've seen in some polling, which is like, yeah, corruption's an issue, but it's number 20 after economy, jobs, prices. And when you have somebody at the top who is delivering on those things, people are not bothered about a little bit of corruption, which is also kind of just understood as part of the game. So it's also interesting because when we talk about the global trends where incumbents are losing, these are three of the largest democracies where they have stayed in power. In India, it was a big deal that Modi lost some vote share and wasn't able to win a constitutional majority. So he wasn't able to make some of the, the big changes to the constitution that people were worried about, particularly the kind of Hindu nationalist policies that certainly concern people who care about pluralist society, but he's still in control, at least for now. So I think that's kind of the more interesting lesson from the three.
It's funny. I was speaking to someone a couple of weeks ago, and she's out here studying. She's Indian, but she's Muslim, and she said her family votes Modi, and have consistently. I said, why? And she said, it's what our family have always done.
Do you know where they live?
They are in Mumbai.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's not like a majority Muslim area, which probably would feel a little different.
Yeah, I think maybe that they were firmly ensconced in the Indian middle class. Maybe it might be a class thing, and But it's just, you can never just, make it, I guess what I took away from that was, Stephen, don't make assumptions about
Yes.
voting intentions in the complexity that is in Indian politics, In
any country, right? I mean, it's that whole, I say that really intentionally because as Democrats, we've all been having to remind ourselves repeatedly, right, that, people of color, whether they're, Latino, Black, whatever the grouping is that you're creating, they're not a monolith, and they all have their own unique interests.
Yeah. Let's round it out by going to parts of Asia that are a little bit closer to certainly where I am, certainly on the same time zone. I want to start with Japan, a country that I know and love very well. The Liberal Democrats have been in power basically all the time since in the post-war reconstruction, apart from a couple of years there in the early 2000s. But obviously they were rocked by a corruption scandal. And they took a haircut in the elections this year that were basically forced upon them. And they dropped 76 seats. Them in the coalition with a Komito, which is the sort of their minor partner in their coalition, so they're down to 215. And the Constitutional Democratic Party, which is kind of like a liberalism / social democratic centre-left party, picked up 52. It's their best result ever. They moved to 148, which, if anyone knows Japanese politics, is huge. Like, I've got friends and family in Japan, and it's a bit like Ireland. In Ireland, family just keep voting for either Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, election after election after election since the Irish Civil War. And in Japan, it's so similar to that as well. They just, it's so family oriented the way that they vote. For this such huge swing towards the CDP, obviously suggested to me that certainly folks in Japan were a little bit fed up with the ruling party. Not much to change though, because obviously they're going to still form a minority government because the minor parties couldn't get their shit together and oust the LDP. But I just found what happened in Japan absolutely fascinating. That's huge for Japan to see such a cataclysmic shift in voting sentiment.
Yeah, and extremely similar to what happened in South Africa. I mean, the parallels are really significant. Yeah.
What's going on in Korea?
Oh yeah, South Korea. So I meant to talk about this in the same context as France and Germany, which maybe while you were sleeping, the government collapsed, or they called elections. So South Korea had elections, parliamentary elections in, I think it was April, and the opposition party took control of the parliament. So it's just like happens in the U.S. very frequently. The party of opposition takes over the parliament, as we do with Congress often. So the president was unable to pass a budget because he was working with parliament of the opposing party. They were not willing to play ball. And he decided to just call for martial law. It was really unbelievable. I mean, this is not a place where that is expected, common, right? There are certainly places around the world where you hear that martial law has been called and you think, oh yeah, okay.
They could do with a bit of martial law.
Right. I've seen pictures of people riding around in trucks with their guns, and it's not unusual. That is not the case at all in South Korea. And it happened overnight there. It was very late at night when he called for martial law, and early in the morning here. So I was watching friends on Instagram, basically, who were out in front of the parliament reporting, protesting against this. It all collapsed within 6 hours. The parliament was able to get back. The parliamentary members were able to get back into the parliament after they had some hard times getting in, but then voted to overturn this, and the president walked it back. So, they kind of moved back to status quo, I guess. But there were, I think the thing that's really funny to me is just like how politicians will hang on. So the story immediately after that was there's no way, if he doesn't step down, the Parliament will call for his impeachment immediately. He's going to be gone tomorrow. This is what everybody was saying. And there was an impeachment vote, but his party pretty quickly, at least enough of them to keep him in office, rallied around and said, oh, actually, we kind of still like having him in power. So he didn't step down. And then kind of, a few days later, basically they took another vote and were able to impeach him. That doesn't mean that he's out yet. I think it has to be approved by the Constitutional Court again. But I would say his term is going to be short-lived after this. But, the relationship to France, again, you've got countries with extremely slim majorities, nobody in strong control, kind of anything. President and parliament led by different parties trying to put together a budget. And it's just been, too much. They haven't been able to come to an agreement that everybody can live with. And that's causing some pretty extreme results.
It's funny when you think about it, because I feel like we are globally in a very uncertain period right now. COVID was a once in a generation moment, which collectively I think governments did and communities did a good job in. Broadly speaking, it varies from country to country, but broadly speaking, there was a lot of unity in countries, political unity in solving this problem that was this pandemic that was going to, if we didn't come together and put our smartest minds to it and respond to this moment, then a lot of people would die. Now we've got this post-COVID challenge, which is an economic challenge, not a medical challenge. And we've put aside all of that unity is now gone, because now we're going back to politics again and saying, well, no, how can I screw you over in order to support my aims to get back into power? And therefore not being able to come to agreement about how to economically respond to the after effects of this. And I think that's, it's happening everywhere, really, isn't it? And it's happening in Australia as well. Like, it's a huge challenge. The economy is a massive challenge for us, and our government's grappling with it, and we're not getting any help from the Conservatives. But do we expect that? Probably not. Anyway, just a reflection. I've got one more question before we wrap up. And this is more, I want to get your reflections on, I guess, strengths and weaknesses of social democratic parties around the world. Like, if we've stayed away from sort of the, as we said at the top of the show, these wins and losses aren't trends of why the right are better than us or what have you. But I do, you do a lot of work overseas, particularly in the campaign space. You and I met in Brussels for a organisers conference, organising digital and data conference with other social democratic Labor and Labor centre-left groups. And so we've both had a bit of experience in hanging out with folks from other parties around the world. What's your take on, like, if you could bring together all the major social democratic or centre-left parties together in one room, what would you say, here are some of the key areas that we all need to work on to be far more effective at it in political campaigning?
Yeah, I think right now it's kind of twofold. One is more the election, like campaign nuts and bolts, and the other is message. So in the nuts and bolts, and actually some of this may not apply as much everywhere, because there are often national television stations that I think people still watch in other countries more so than here. But the media environment is so fractured, it is still extremely difficult to reach people in meaningful ways, not just at election time, but in all of the times in between. So people are shearing off into their groups and forming really strong, strongly held opinions without any engagement with other ideas. And we on the left have not done a great job of building and owning the channels to reach people and have those conversations the way that the right has, certainly in the US, I think in the UK even, actually. we need to build the channels. It's not just like the content, but the channels to communicate to more people consistently over time. That's going to be a big issue in the US, certainly, and I suspect kind of everywhere. It's using the channels that already exist as well, like TikTok. I think we're generally on the left not that great at using it in ways that feel authentic. We've gotten maybe a little bit better at it, but it's still like the 5 campaign TikToks rather than the whole ecosystem that we need to be building on those platforms. So that's one thing. The other, on the message side, there has been a shift away from experts since 2016. I think we saw that as, Brexit first, and then with Trump being elected, there was a real backlash against, the eggheads in the Capitol, whether that's London, Washington, wherever. People are really searching for authentic interactions. And even though we know that on the left, we're really not good at communicating in an authentic way, and we tend to be the mouthpiece of institutions that regular people feel like are not serving them. Mm-hmm. So instead of saying, we want to act to make sure that you have enough to eat or the opportunities to have a great life, we're talking about protecting institutions, and people feel like those institutions are the problem. And they see our messaging not so much as serving them, but as serving these institutions. So I think that is certainly the case in the US, but actually is true throughout Western Europe. Absolutely. And we need to talk more about how we care about the people and have plans to help support them live better lives.
To that second point, and certainly, I mean, my experience of some of the social democratic parties that I've engaged with in Western Europe on a professional level, it has shocked me how disconnected they are from what I'd call the constituency. And if you look at what the centre-right parties are always talking about to their voters, are the issues that really should be in the centre-left column. They're talking about jobs and job security, and education, and investment in infrastructure and building things. Whereas I find that we're talking about, to your point, a whole bunch of other stuff that we think is important to us, but actually most voters don't give a rat's ass about. Where did that happen? I don't know even when that began. Like,
oh man, I don't know if this is still true, but it was definitely true in the past. Like the left are the nerds, for the most part, the policy nerds. The right has them too, but they're like in the think tanks. They don't run for office. Our nerds run for office too. And they're interested in the details. They care about the facts. And so that's what they talk about. And it's not that, obviously, the left and the center left, it's not that we don't care about people. We do. I would argue far more, actually, than the right or the populists, who are excellent about talking about it. It's just that we're not communicating effectively.
What? Funny anecdote, just to wrap up the show. The 2018 Victorian state election, we're in the final week of the campaign, and our all we're essentially doing now is just direct voter contact, because there's nothing else to do. And our policy team had basically wrapped up. They had nothing else to do, and they were sort of sitting around going, "What can we do now?" I said, "Just get on the phones. We'll run a phone back each night from CHQ, and if you want to make calls, you make calls." So our policy team got on the phones and started calling through, voters. Now these targets are likely persuadables or likely undecideds, not turnout. And they said, one of them remarked, "This is fascinating. I'm actually seeing all the policies that I've worked on now boiled down to some basic scripts where I've just got some key talking points, and one of them remarked saying, I should have done this 12 months ago because I'm getting feedback from voters on actually the policy that I play a serious part in designing. And I can see some areas where it's really good, and I can see some other areas I'm going, shouldn't have done that, And I'm not criticizing that person, but it just shows you the disconnect, right, between policy development and the people. And I thought that was a good campaign. We won, and we won big. But even still, it wasn't perfect, was it?
No. The other thing is just like policy development, language development. It's really easy to write a memo and not have any interaction, with another human being and sort of have your talking points and sell what it is that you're working on. When you have to actually engage with somebody and they ask you a question you don't want to answer or a complicated question, you can't just pivot, right? You can't, you can't just not answer their question if it's at the doorstep. It's not like even being on the news or something like that, where politicians are usually very effective at changing this story. So I totally agree. I think everybody should be forced to get on the doors at least some point. If not, the phone's fine. But to actually have to talk to voters, even for one day, you have a completely different perspective of how it goes. So, I think it's great that you guys did that. Hopefully they'll be up for it next time.
Maybe. We'll see. Katie Parsons, lovely to travel around the world with you today. Really appreciated it. You're a great companion. And thank you for your contribution to not just to today's episode, but obviously to the podcast over the certainly second half of the year. And I want to wish you and all of you folks in the Windy City a warm and festive break. Hopefully it doesn't get too windy and too cold, because I know those Chicago winters can be pretty biting in the Midwest. But thanks for coming on the show today. Yeah,
it's been super fun. Thank you. This was a lot more fun than talking about losing the election. But it's been really fun and really, really an honor for me to be able to do this all year. It's been great. Thank you.
Good on you. Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.